So I think at this conference, there's quite a lot of interesting new data, but most of it is being presented in poster form, so at a basic science type of level and also in terms of clinical things. But I think really at this meeting there isn't really that much new data that we're going to see that's impacting on clinical practice. And I think a lot of the discussion at this meeting will be about what we've seen pretty recently, 3 months ago at ASCO in Chicago. And to some extent, how what we've seen in the last sort of few years is going to impact the future. And also I think that there are quite a few studies that we're looking forward to the results of, which we're going to get in the next year or two. So that's really how I would see this meeting. Well, I think some of the big questions at the moment in treating melanoma, first of all, there's a big question about adjuvant treatment. There have now been a couple of adjuvant studies that have pretty much recruited in the last year or two of checkpoint inhibitors, in other words, immunotherapy. We won't have the results of those for a little while, but there's been quite a lot of interest in that. The same is true that the targeted adjuvant therapy studies basically recruited a little while ago now, and it might be in the next year or two that we get some results, so that will definitely be interesting. I think in advanced disease, stage 4 disease, there's probably 2 or 3 big questions. One is the question of in BRAF mutant melanoma, should you start with BRAF targeted therapy or should you start with immunotherapy? In other words, what's the best sequence? Again, we don't really have any trials that are reported that are helping us with that, but there's at least a couple of trials that are going on to address those kinds of questions. And I think one of the other really big questions in advanced disease at the moment with checkpoint inhibitors, immune checkpoint inhibitors, is should you go with a single agent, so something like nivolumab or pembrolizumab, or should you go with the combination of nivolumab and ipilimumab? So all of those options are approved, and really the big question is that we know that the combination immunotherapy's got more side effects. Certainly, both options, in other words, nivolumab or pembrolizumab alone or combination immunotherapy are better than IPI alone. But which patients should you be treating with each of those treatment options? And we still really don't have any good answers to that. So that's a kind of a hot topic still in the field. I think there is a lot of public awareness of melanoma. We all know that melanoma is increasing very quickly in pretty much most Western countries. I think most people know also, certainly in my experience of treating patients at the Marsden, that sun exposure or sunburn is a risk factor for melanoma. But I think that translating that knowledge into action is a separate thing. So in Australia, there was a very successful public health campaign, in the 80s and 90s, slip, slap, slop, which meant that sunburn, particularly amongst children, really went down. And actually the incidence of melanoma, I think, in Australia is now going down. But, just anecdotally, if you go on your summer holidays in Europe to the Mediterranean or, in the UK where we have our sort of few days of hot weather, I still see people doing what I wouldn't regard as particularly safe behaviour in the sun, with young children. So I think that we know the message, actually. I think everyone knows the message about avoiding sunburn, but I'm not certain it's clearly being translated into action, on a day-to-day basis, at least in Europe. So I think there's still more to do in terms of trying to address that. I think in terms of the sorts of trial results that we're waiting for in the near future, at least in advanced melanoma, really the overall survival data from the CheckMate 067 study is the thing that we're most eagerly anticipating. So this was a study with 3 different arms, so ipilimumab alone, IPI, nivolumab alone, or the combination of the 2 drugs together. So what we know so far is that both the experimental arms, in other words, nivolumab alone and the combination, were better than IPI in terms of progression-free survival and in terms of response rate. But the trial isn't mature for overall survival. And I think we would anticipate having some overall survival data from that trial, certainly in the next 12 months or so, or possibly slightly sooner. And that's quite a big question because these are all approved treatment options, but the combination of the 2 drugs together has a lot more side effects. So one question is, well, actually, do you need the 2 drugs together given the side effect profile? Or Might there be certain patients, for example, and maybe this could be based on PD-L1 expression, who you can reasonably treat with just, say, nivolumab or pembrolizumab for that matter, because they're going to get significant efficacy, and then maybe think about using the combination treatment in tumours where there isn't high PD-L1 expression. So for me, that's one of the eagerly awaited results. Another result that's pretty eagerly awaited actually is from the adjuvant trial of ipilimumab at 10 milligrams per kilogram, so the higher dose. That's the ORTC study. So we already know that there's a disease-free survival advantage from that study, which has led to approval in the US. But I think a big question for everybody again is, what about the overall survival data from that study as well? So I'd probably flag those two studies as being studies that everyone in the field is looking forward to seeing mature survival data, which I hope we will get in the next 6 to 12 months.